Welcome to Eye on Korea, a video podcast produced by the Korea Economic Institute of America. Join us for in-depth conversations with experts and policymakers as we explore issues in Korea's economic and political relationship with the United States and how these issues may influence South Korea's regional strategies and its global relationships. I'm Scott Snyder, President and CEO of the Korea Economic Institute, and today I'm joined by Professor Barry Eichengreen of the University of California at Berkeley. Barry Eichengreen is the George C. Pardee and Helen N. Pardee Chair and Distinguished Professor of Economics and Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. He is a Research Associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research and Research Fellow of the Center for Economic Policy Research. He was a Senior Policy Advisor at the IMF in 1997 and 1998 during the Asian financial crisis, or what Koreans know as the IMF crisis. Professor Eichengreen, welcome to Eye on Korea.
Good to be with you, Scott.
Now, you've been writing for many years on the unique privileges and benefits that the U.S. derives from the role of the dollar as the world's reserve currency, and about the benefits the U.S. gains from the dollar's status as a global reserve currency. What are the costs associated with the dollar potentially losing that role? And what are the signposts that we should be focused on currently that would signify that the dollar might lose its role as the world's reserve currency?
I think the costs would be quite significant, starting with the convenience that U.S. banks and firms derive from being able to do cross-border business, international business in their own currency. They don't have to worry that the exchange rate will move against them in the meantime. They don't have to buy derivatives, currency hedges to protect them against that danger. The U.S. government can borrow more cheaply than otherwise, given that there has been this large captive demand out there for U.S. Treasury securities, foreign reserves of central banks, sovereign wealth funds, and others. The U.S. has derived kind of a automatic form of insurance as a result of the dollar's safe haven status. So when a bad thing happens, rather than the dollar collapsing on the foreign exchange market, it strengthens because it's the safe haven. Markets in U.S. Treasuries have been the deepest and most liquid financial market in the world. That happened even in 2008 when Lehman Brothers failed. We did the bad thing, yet the dollar strengthened on the foreign exchange market. And finally, the dollar's international status gives the U.S. government financial and geopolitical leverage. We saw that in 2022 with the imposition of sanctions on Russia. So I think the benefits are very great. And until very recently, rhetoric and writing coming out of the Trump administration has emphasized the costs of the dollar's international status, which I regard as second order, and the neglect of the aforementioned benefits, which are first order. Fortunately, I think some of them have begun to moderate that unbalanced rhetoric. What should we look for? Finally, you asked, we should look for a combination of dollar weakness on the foreign exchange market and higher interest rates on U.S. Treasuries. If the two appear at the same time, that indicates that someone is moving out of U.S. Treasuries toward other investments, presumably in investments in other safe assets denominated in other currencies. So I would emphasize we're still in early days. People have drawn all kinds of cosmic inferences from the events since Liberation Day on April 2nd, and it's still premature to figure out how far this will go.
Okay. I appreciate that cautionary note. What about for allies like South Korea who are linked to the U.S. both through security and through economics because of the dollar's role? How do you think that allies should be responding to the current environment?
Well, I think it puts allies in a very difficult position. On the one hand, they share the incentive of central banks and governments around the world. now that they're conscious of Trump risk, of the erratic nature of U.S. policy, they have an incentive to diversify away from the dollar. Diversify away is different than dump the dollar. I don't think anybody is talking about going that far, but to hedge their bets, not put all their eggs in the dollar basket. That's the sensible financial response on the one hand, but you don't want to do anything that will jeopardize your good relations with your security partner. So any visible move away from the dollar could conceivably attract the ire of the Trump administration. So it's a walking on eggshells kind of moment.
And of course, last week we had the IMF World Bank spring meetings here, and the governor of the Bank of Korea was also here, senior economic officials from the administration. What do you imagine those conversations might have been like between the Bank of Korea governor and potential counterparts or with the Secretary of the Treasury?
I think it's not only the Bank of Korea governor and the finance minister from Korea, but all the foreign officials have been choosing their words very carefully because they know that they're dealing with an unpredictable U.S. administration that seems to be easily provoked. But everything I have read and everything I can imagine suggests that Korean officials came in a conciliatory mood, trying to leave the impression that they were prepared to negotiate, and they fully expected to reach some kind of agreement. I've heard it referred to not as a formal agreement, but a package, whatever that exactly means, by the end of the 90-day period that began in early April, after which the supposed temporary suspension of the reciprocal tariffs will expire.
And I think that characterizes the conversation on the Treasury side. I'm just curious, what do you think the central bank governor conversation would look like, given the questions about the dollar and its future? What would you be looking for if you were Korea's central bank governor? And what would be the measures that you would want to take in response to the current situation?
Well, South Korea is in a very good situation in that it has a good central bank governor. And I would expect him to have evaded the exchange rate question because the preference of the United States would be to revalue the won against the dollar. This is not in Korea's interest, given relatively weak economic growth, 1% this year at best. That's not a situation where a stronger currency would be helpful. Presumably, Korean officials were reminded that the country is running a very large, $56 billion trade surplus vis-a-vis the United States. All the more reason in the U.S. view for Korea to revalue its currency. But that's not in Korea's interest. And I think the governor, I'm sure, did all he could not to have to point this out.
Okay. Another question I have is about Korea's dollar reserves. And my understanding is that they're jointly held between the central bank and the government. As one considers the prospect of dollar devaluation and Korea's ongoing negotiations with the United States, how do you think that the Korean government is looking at those reserves?
Well, I do not think it is an advantage for Korea that the reserves are jointly held. Were they held exclusively by the central bank, the Korean government could remind the U.S. that the central bank is independent and it makes its own decision and it can't be pressured by the Korean government or anyone else over its reserve management decisions. the fact that the Korean government is involved with that reserve management opens a door to the United States potentially, one government potentially pressuring the other. So your question alerted me to an institutional arrangement that I was not aware of before, that the reserves are jointly held. And I would urge you and your listeners to keep that on the quiet.
Okay. I also want to ask about just the volatility of the current situation and the on-again, off-again nature of the implementation of these tariffs, quite setting aside the issue of whether or not they're good or bad. What do you think how do you think that allies are responding, and what do you think is the greatest concern as we try to navigate this particular moment, given the level of volatility that exists?
The mildest word that springs to mind is they are responding with alarm, because this is a very serious, very grave economic and even financial situation. So major investment banks have raised the odds of a recession in the United States to 90% by the end of the year. And that strikes me as entirely realistic and in terms of the probabilities. Economies like Korea's cannot skate through those kind of problems unscathed. So, and I think they also understand that if the policies of the Trump administration create a U.S. or global recession, U.S. officials will look for someone else to blame. Last week, the likely target was the Fed. Next week, the likely target could be our trading partners, especially those which run surpluses vis-a-vis the United States. The skyscraper tariffs, I'm invoking a term from Smoot-Hawley days. That's what they were called in the 1930s. If they were to come back after the 90-day pause, would be extremely disruptive. And the tariffs that are currently in place on China, along with Chinese retaliation, are extremely disruptive as well. It's a matter of days or weeks before the empty shelves begin to appear in the United States and perhaps in China as well. But I think the dominant problem is uncertainty, that no one can plan for what comes next because they don't know what comes next. And that applies to Chaebol and other Korean exporters as much as it does to U.S. firms. And it applies to consumers in both countries as well. So we already hear reports in the U.S. about consumers holding off on those car purchases and so forth because they don't know what the economy will bring. You can tell me whether Korean consumers are beginning to think along these lines as well.
Well, I don't think that it's had an impact on the shelves yet, and I actually am curious. The tariff war really seems to be the U.S. between the U.S. and China. What does that mean for Korea? It doesn't seem like they're not likely to follow suit. And so that means that the China-Korea economic trade relationship would probably continue.
Well, ideally that would be the case, but we have heard from Secretary Bessent and other U.S. officials that the strategy, such as it is to create a coalition of the willing, a unified front of countries that will isolate China. Of course, the way the U.S. has gone about it so far has been counterproductive from that point of view, but leave that aside for a moment. If there is a renewed effort to create a unified front to isolate China, what does that imply for Korean companies with foreign investments in China, with extensive links to both the U.S. and Chinese economies? And the answer is speculative, but my speculative answer to the question would be it implies nothing good.
So Korea is also in this situation where politically, at least if both leaders were to come to APEC in November, Korea would be the venue for some kind of potential interaction between Trump and Xi. What do you think would be the right approach in terms of trying to broker that sort of meeting? I know November feels like a very distant prospect at this point, but what would be the issues on which Korea might want to engage in this particular context as they think about APEC planning?
Well, I think we're going to have to wait and see what the ask of the U.S. government is, what the objectives in this trade war are of the U.S. government. We've heard half a dozen and more different objectives being bandied around so far. You can't broker if you don't know what the asks or the goals of the two sides are. So the United States, I think, would like more inward foreign investment that's consistent with the notion, misguided or not, to bring back manufacturing jobs to the United States. So for its part, South Korea, you may want to come later to the question, Scott, of what South Korea should do. But, Hyundai should ramp up its production investment in the United States. And I think South Korea can point to that and say Chinese companies that are producing items that are not dual-use technologies, where the United States is not concerned about their presence, might want to ramp up in investment. China might, like South Korea, ramp up imports of soybeans and natural gas from the U.S. Those are I think, the kind of commercial issues that the Trump administration has in mind. Personally, I think the longer-standing issues around intellectual property and the like are more important, and those may chime in with the Trump administration's concern about security issues as well. So those are at least some of the agenda items that I think should come up in November, and I hope that Mr. Trump will visit for more than 14 hours when the time comes.
Okay. Well, I'm sure that some of those issues are going to be, I think, front and center with the 90 days, if I understand correctly. So that's probably the jumping off point. What does the Trump administration really want as related to the value of the dollar? It seems like there's some declaratory statements suggesting they want it to be strong, but the policies seem to be driving it down.
I think we have to avoid falling into the trap of assuming that they have a want, that there is a strategy and a goal here. We are trained as analysts and academics and so forth to assume that there is a strategy and then a set of tactics for implementing that strategy, where I'm not sure that the ideas of the Trump administration around the dollar are that well developed. There is a faction. I identify it with Stephen Miran, the head of Trump's Council of Economic Advisors, which thinks that a weaker dollar would be good for U.S. manufacturing competitiveness. My own view is that the level of the dollar is item number 11 down the list of determinants of U.S. export competitiveness, which start with innovative capacity, research and development, the skill and training of American workers. And when you get to item number 11, you get the fact that a slightly weaker dollar exchange rate might be helpful. On the other hand, the Trump administration does not want to do anything that would excite or destabilize financial markets. And talking down the dollar, as we've already seen, has that potential. So we've heard people like Treasury Secretary Bessent echo in his own words the classic phrase of Secretary Robert Rubin that we believe in a strong dollar, which is code for we don't talk about the level of the dollar and we don't want to excite financial markets. So I think in Treasury, that is the priority. I think people who are pushing for a weaker dollar, having seen the financial chaos that can result, have backed off of that view. So going forward, I think they've learned hands off the dollar is probably the only safe strategy.
So what do you expect for the $1 exchange rate in particular? Because Korea's been in this political paralysis, this state of political paralysis. They're going to come out of it later in the summer. They've got the negotiations on tariffs. And you also have the broader contextual background, the impact of tariffs on the global economy.
I expect the dollar to keep weakening against virtually all other currencies because of the high policy uncertainty in the United States and because of new questions about rule of law and contract enforcement. Will the financial claims of foreigners on the U.S. Treasury be honored? That question has never been asked before in my lifetime, but it's being actively asked now. So I would expect the dollar to continue to weaken. It will weaken the most against the currencies of strongly growing economies, and Korea is not there at the moment, and most against the currencies whose political stability and rule of law are look more favorable than that of the United States. So Korea is moving in that direction. You know, the fact that the process has worked in terms of resignation of the president and impending elections and all that is definitely a positive from the point of view of rule of law and upholding the Constitution and listening to the Supreme Court. But as you kind of implied before, the process has to play out with a successful election and hopefully election of a consensus candidate. So I'm not as expert on Korean politics as many people. I'm not as expert on Korean politics as you are, Scott. But you know, the fact that there are Korea, in a different way than the United States, but like the United States, suffers from political polarization and these repeated swings between left and right. And that political configuration is a challenge for having a strong currency. So all this is by way of saying the won is probably not going to be one of the currencies that will strengthen the against the dollar over the coming year.
Final question I have for you is a little bit of a technical question, but Korea's been retail testing the central bank digital currency, CBDC, and I'd like for you to tell us what are CBDCs and what can they be used for?
So central bank digital currencies are digital tokens or equivalent. If you're talking about a retail CBDC, which means you and I get to use it, it's central bank money that instead of holding in our wallet in the form of a paper bill, it's a token that gets dropped into a wallet on our phones or into an app on our phones, and then it can be used instead of your credit card or PayPal or Alipay or whatever. When you go down to Starbucks and buy a cup of coffee, you can hold your phone up and transfer a token out of your CBDC wallet or app, and that can be a convenience for consumers. But I drew the analogy with Alipay and PayPal and so forth. I don't think this is a big deal or a big advance because we already have other electronic forms of payment. But the private sector has figured out how to do this and do it reliably. So The people I know who use PayPal, I don't use it very much. My Chinese friends who use Alipay are quite happy with the convenience and low cost of that. On the other hand, there are wholesale central bank digital currencies. In this case, you and I don't hold the central bank digital unit, but your bank holds it. And the wholesale CBDC can be used for payments between banks, wholesale, high-value payments. And that opens up the possibility of transferring central bank money from bank to bank across borders. So a transfer from a South Korean bank to a Chinese bank that doesn't have to go through the dollar or through the New York clearinghouse or be communicated from one bank to the other through SWIFT, the messaging system that's used in the interbank market. Rather, one central bank money can be exchanged directly for another central bank money. So what I described before, the correspondent banking system, is expensive, slow, and a bit outdated, and also subject to U.S. sanctions risk. So if you're China, you already have second thoughts about relying on it. This opens up another set of rails, if you will, for making cross-border payments, not between you and me, but between a Korean bank and a Chinese bank or whatever. So I expect to see that initiative move forward.
Okay, well, thank you for that explanation, and thank you for spending time with us today. And thank you for joining us today for Eye on Korea. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like the podcast, subscribe so you won't miss the next one, and leave a review to help others discover the show. Follow the Korea Economic Institute of America on social media or visit keia.org for more resources, events, and expert analysis on Korea. We'll see you next time on Eye on Korea.